Hello, welcome. Welcome everybody to this seminar hosted by the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. First of all, I have to mention that this event is going to be streamed and then available online. So for those who could not make it, I hope that they are watching from somewhere else or will be watching later in the future. This seminar is part of a climate policy series, which is organized by the Climate and Energy Research Group here at NUPI, in partnership this time with King's College London, represented by my dear colleague Thomas Maltby, who is going to say a couple of words.
Thank you, Casper. So thanks everyone for attending either in person or virtually. I think this has been planned for about 3 years, something like that. 4 years ago, we started to think about doing a workshop that stemmed from another project. COVID got in the way. I think if we did this about a year ago, something like this, we would be talking about, I don't know, the potential for a kind of critical juncture about building back better, building back greener, and how that might be affecting climate policy and discourse. And now a separate or additional perhaps window of opportunity or juncture from Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine. So I think we're going to have hopefully a lot of really interesting reflections from our excellent sort of panel and keynote this morning, and then continue that in the closed session later. So yeah, so thank you very much for coming along here, and we'll look forward to your participation in our Q&A as well in about 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
So the topic of today is delay as the new denial in climate policy and climate politics. The idea comes from, or is well inspired by a fairly recent book by the climatologist Michael Mann, who suggested that the new climate war which we're going to fight is against certain deeply entrenched interests and incumbents who are going to defend the status quo by delaying ambitious climate action, and therefore delay becomes this new form of climate denialism, not so open perhaps, but focused on slightly different things. Yeah, so this is what we're going to explore today, and we have really a fantastic set of distinguished guests. We will start by a keynote which is going to be delivered by Professor Jenny Stevens from Northeastern University in Boston, who is temporarily on sabbatical at Trinity College Dublin. So just so you know, we didn't fly her in from the US, which would kind of clash with the whole point of this workshop. And then we're going to have a discussion in a larger group featuring Professor Brian Peterson from Northern Arizona University, who's also been in Europe and is staying in Europe, so again, the same thing. And also Mariana Milkoreit, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology and Human Geography at the University of Oslo. Yes, so without further ado, Jenny, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and really looking forward to today's discussion. So I thought I could start things off by kind of framing where we are and a little bit of personal experience. I wrote this book, Diversifying Power: Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy, in 2020. In response to my own experience working in climate energy for 25 years and actually being trained in environmental science and engineering with a very technical, scientific, technocratic perspective on climate and energy. And what I've realized, and why I wrote this book, is that that lens is leading to completely inadequate, insufficient perspectives on what needs to happen. So I have recently, and in the book, I talk about this concept of climate isolationism, which represents this narrow way of thinking about climate as a problem that's separate from everything else, when in fact it is not the problem. The problem is extractive, exploitative, capitalist systems that are perpetuating, concentrating wealth and power, and climate is a manifestation of it. And the reason we are unable to address the climate crisis is because of these power structures. So when I talk about anti-racist feminist leadership, it's an invitation for all of us to constantly be thinking about power dynamics. Who is being included, who is excluded, who's benefiting, who's being disadvantaged, and how are these structures and systems being perpetuated. So in the few minutes I have to kind of kick off this discussion, I want to just highlight again that I think the problem is economic injustice, and the powers that be want to keep that because those who are profiting want to sustain their concentration of wealth and power, and that is the resistance that we're seeing and why the science isn't being integrated into policy. But we can see that this is just in the United States before the pandemic, the widening income and wealth gap, and it's really as there are more and more billionaires, it by definition, because of our economic system, it means there's more and more people who are really, really struggling because of our extractive and exploitative economy. And the report earlier this year showed that the billionaires during the pandemic more than doubled their wealth, whereas most people are worse off after the pandemic. So that just shows that we have these systems that are perpetuating this concentration of wealth and power. And how that's related to climate denialism or climate delay is that the polluter elite, Dario Kenner has coined those who are profiting from the fossil fuel-based energy systems and society have been making strategic investments for decades to resist the changes that are needed. And with a misinformation campaign to deny the climate science and promote fossil fuels, to undermine public trust in government and public investments, and also minimize worker protections and worker rights and really disempower workers and the people, so that we've gotten disconnected from what is in the public interest, I think. So we're here today to talk about climate obstruction and the climate denial that was very blatant, saying no, there's no problem with climate change. It's not an issue, or it's not caused by fossil fuels. That's one instance of climate obstruction. But we're talking today about delay, which is more subtle. Deception and distraction, and I will argue that we have been experiencing climate delay for decades, right? That's what this, it was associated, the climate denial, what seemed more, obviously nefarious, I guess, but climate delay has been there all along, and is kind of the, what has led to our inadequate and non-transformative actions. So there's all kinds of ways to think about climate delay, and it comes up all in so many different discourses and so many different change is hard. So there's all kinds of ways to talk about it. And what I want to focus on is how technology and technological approaches to climate mitigation are in fact part of climate delay. And the basis for that is that we have invested so much into technological innovation, and we have underinvested massively in social innovation. And so that's kind of the premise here. And the two examples that I want to talk about are carbon capture and storage and solar geoengineering as examples of how technology is in fact delay. So I come at this that we're at a point, I'm very concerned citizen of the world, and I'm sure many of you are. But I also see that we're at a time for opportunity for really outside breaking down some of the mainstream narratives and norms. And I think we need this transformative lens to do that, and we need to get beyond technology. So climate isolationism is this concept that I have written about this narrow technocratic lens. It's very much based on masculine colonial ideas of domination and control of nature. It also has this technological optimism built in, and it perpetuates an exploitative economy. And by focusing on climate isolationism, on the climate as, focusing on greenhouse gas emission reductions and decarbonization in a narrow technocratic way, not connecting it with jobs and housing and transportation and food and education, we're missing opportunities for investing in people and communities and what people need. So I propose that we, instead of focusing on climate policy in a narrow way, we focus on social and economic justice, and we can use the term climate justice to kind of represent this different lens. And we need to focus on investing in people and communities, base those investments on human dignity and basic needs, what some have called like a people's first approach. What do people need? When we do this, we will distribute power, literally and figuratively, right? We can think about the distribution of the energy system and taking away the big power and wealth of fossil fuel interest in a distributed renewable-based future. But we also can think about how that relates to distributing economic and political power as well. And we can leverage urgency from the climate crisis for this social justice transformation. So it's not forgetting about climate change, but it's like climate isn't we can leverage the urgency because climate does have a temporal dimension that's very acute. But we can reframe and kind of think more broadly about social and economic justice. So the two examples I want to talk about just very briefly before I end and open it up to more discussion are carbon capture and storage and solar geoengineering. And I've written about both of these technologies and kind of tried to understand how technologies end up being part of the delay strategy. And so I started looking at doing research on carbon capture and storage in 2002 when it was kind of this new idea, and it actually was huge in terms of bringing fossil fuel interests to the table, because it allowed the fossil fuel interests to let go of some of the climate denial and say, okay, we can accept that climate change is happening, fossil fuels are contributing, and we can invest in a technology, futuristic, way off technology, that will enable us to continue with our core business, and we can have this technology that will reconcile. So it really changed this technology, particularly in the United States, but around the world, with all fossil fuel focused, interested countries, really helped move away from the climate denial, because it allowed a vision of a future where we can have technology, a technological fix, and we don't have to do anything drastic with our fossil fuels. We can actually still use all of our fossil fuels, but we'll have this mechanism to reduce the carbon emissions going into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels. The other, this slide I found in my slide deck, which I created in 2007, which I'm coming back to today, to talk about technology imaginaries and these varying perceptions of technology readiness. So when I was studying carbon capture and storage in 2007, there were some people who said, we know how to do this, we just need to implement the technology, invest and just get these technologies going. And there were others who were saying, we still need revolutionary technical advancement is needed for us to use technology to address climate. And there was a big span in between, right? And I think this technological readiness is key to where different people end up in the technology discussion. But basically, you can call for deployment of existing technologies, or you can call for intensive increase in R&D. And in the United States, the biggest response to climate change for decades has been invest in R&D, right? That is the response, and not thinking about social change, social justice, social innovation. So the other example, very quickly, I want to get to, and this is solar geoengineering. And this, you can argue, is like the ultimate techno fix for delaying and distracting from social change and social justice and social innovation, because this gets just about temperature. Okay, if climate change is the problem, the temperature is increasing, how can we cool the temperature of the Earth? And so it's about injecting sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere and cooling, average cooling of the global average temperature. I think this is completely scary, dangerous, risky. There's been a lot of resistance to this, and very powerful actors are supporting this. And philanthropists, private sector have gotten involved, have been supporting. The Harvard Solar Geoengineering Research Project is the biggest, and I have been engaged with some of the people there and know some of the people there, and they are also now trying to demonstrate this technology, and they've also done a National Academy of Science report, which kind of legitimizes this and is now advocating for public funds to support research on solar geoengineering. So I think that I'm part of a network of social scientists who are resisting getting involved, trying to get involved to resist the very powerful, very well-funded interests that are pushing for advancing solar geoengineering research, to highlight all the risks associated with it. And very quickly, I will just say, one of the biggest ones is it creates one more mechanism for very select, wealthy, powerful interests to influence everybody else, and to their benefit, right? Because there's no way we don't have a global governance system that could do this democratically. And the other thing that's a fundamental flaw with this idea is that we know that given the complexity of how the Earth systems work, any manipulation of the system will not be the same everywhere. So some places will be optimized. Whoever's probably doing it will optimize for their place, but other places could be way worse off, and it could disrupt kind of the whole Southeast Asian monsoon season, and have huge impacts on agriculture and food and water systems throughout the whole world. So it's very, very dangerous, I think, and it's also a delay tactic, a distraction, because whether or not the scientists are working on this, accept this, it provides one more narrative in our repertoire of, oh, we don't have to change because we might be able to do this, right? So to end here, I will just say, I think we're at a point where transformative change is necessary, and we need social and economic systems changes. There's insufficiency in kind of our incremental approach. There's insufficiency in our technological approach, and we need innovation in social change, social justice, financial system innovation. Why are the billionaires doubling their wealth during COVID with public funds that have been injected? Like, that is fundamentally bad for everybody, including the billionaires. So, so I'm really interested in how can we, as researchers and academics and other policy engaged folks, do research on delay that has an impact and tries to understand and reveal the delay strategies, but also move us beyond them. So I think we're at a point for real transformation. We did alignment of action and collective action in lots of different ways. I think we can think about how we can expand our influence, how can we leverage our own power and privilege through research and other mechanisms, how can we engage with the social and economic innovations that need to happen, and how to resist the fossil fuel interests, because many of us are part of, we're all part of the powerful systems and structures. So I think there's a lot for us to talk about here, and I do mention the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as one specific mechanism that individuals and institutions can, and cities and towns and countries can embrace, and I will stop there. Thank you. Rearranging
here. stage. Yes, we can just sit in the middle. Brian? Yeah. Thank you very much for this inspiring and broad keynote. I think you've highlighted a lot of themes which are really interesting, both from a global perspective, but also from this particular Norwegian perspective, because of course we are interested in some of those themes, perhaps more than others, being here in Norway. Before we come back to this, I just wanted to ask Brian, I mean, we've been talking about delay as this new, or well, something that comes after denial, and we do have evidence from different regions and countries that climate denialism is in a way in retreat, so it's not so prominent anymore. It becomes taboo in certain milieus, perhaps. But still, I mean, it exists, and perhaps we could spend a moment talking about climate denialism in this more open form. And you've authored a paper about ideological denialism. Can you just say a bit more about what this is, and then what are the characteristics of this, and how does climate denialism manifest itself right now?
Yeah, thank you. So we have a slightly different take on denialism. It is true that for a long time people were outright denialists, especially fossil fuel industry and so forth. We're actually interested in a slightly different perspective, which is to say ideological denialism is really the problem when people refuse to acknowledge the actual root causes of climate change. So they care about climate change, they think it's a problem, but fail to acknowledge the actual root cause of what's causing climate change. And then by extension, support the wrong kinds of actions to address climate change. The wrong kinds being, of course, ones that are ineffective. And so rather than focusing on Republicans in the US or fossil fuel entities, ideological denialism actually focuses on environmentalists for the most part. So I agree that outright denialism is probably in retreat, but I think actually ideological denialism is on the rise, and part for what we just heard in the presentation. And so just as a couple of examples, if you suggest that climate change is just a technical problem, then you can use any kind of intervention to address it, like solar panels or whatever else. But those are totally ineffective because actually climate change is not a technical problem. And so that's the real challenge. Not only do we have a really important block in terms of fossil fuel interests, corporate media, and so forth around just absolute denial, but then we have environmentalists who actually care about climate change who also are in denial because they refuse to acknowledge what's causing climate change. I can tell you, after we wrote the paper, people were not happy, and we got a lot of behind the scenes, some negative comments. I'll just leave it at that. But the point is, people take this very personally, because if you care about climate change, you're not a denialist. You don't consider yourself a denialist. And yet, as we just heard, we're not doing anything even remotely close to what is required to actually overcome climate change. And that's what ideological denialism was all about. So for us, it's extremely important, precisely because it's the people who care the most who are actually in denial about it. And again, that's just not a popular position, but we think it's actually really important. So even though we're getting more attention, even though the US is passing presumably a groundbreaking law, in my view personally, it wasn't a groundbreaking law precisely because it just extends this technological approach and fundamentally doesn't address why we have climate change in the first place, which is around economic expansion. And if you don't address that, you can't really overcome climate change, and so it's a form of denial.
So just to clarify and specify this, would you say that a large part of the environmental movement is kind of in some way involved in greenwashing the current system?
Yes. Now again, this is not popular, and I wouldn't say it's outright direct greenwashing. That's why it's ideological. It's almost like subconscious, because we're embedded in a society that prioritizes certain things like economic growth, wealth, jobs, and so forth. That's always at the forefront, and so we can only take climate action that legitimates and keeps in place those kinds of elements in society. The problem is, of course, you can't keep an economic system that's perpetuating growth and reduce inequality, climate change, material use, deforestation. Those are incompatible. And so for us, the ideological denialism is really about contradictions. It's about the notion that we can keep the system in place and address climate change. Those are in contradiction. You can't do that. And so again, that's why the environmental movement has been so ineffective in our view, because they don't grapple with that reality and continue to push policies and actions that are just fundamentally not capable of addressing climate change.
Very, very interesting. Jenny, I have a question which kind of builds on this, I guess, focusing on this notion of technocracy. I mean, you've talked a lot about different technologies and our kind of technofix that we have in trying to solve the problem of climate change. Of course, there are different technologies that have different socioeconomic impacts. A colleague at the University of Sussex, Andrew Sterling, he has distinguished between two kinds of transition pathways, those that are kind of conservative and those which are more radical and progressive in the sense that technologies that they build on also create some kind of a social change around them. And obviously the technologies you've been talking about were the conservative ones. But then technocracy is also a feature of the climate movement to a great extent because it builds so much on science. And, you know, Fridays for the Future or Greta Thunberg, they create out of science this kind of ideal and something with which we are not supposed to really debate. So there's this kind of technocratic ecocentrism, somebody called this. How do we distinguish between those technologies which are transformative and have this radical edge and those that are, that don't? I mean, what would be your recipe for this?
So I guess I would think, rather than think about individual technologies, think about the broader systemic change that needs to happen. Right now we have predominantly fossil fuel-based society, right? And, which is not serving us well, right, for lots of reasons. So if we acknowledge we want to move away from a fossil fuel-based society toward a renewable-based society, I think that is the principle. And of course, you need new technologies to do that, right? We need renewable technologies, we need some energy storage, we need different transmission systems. But the answer, the solution isn't the technologies, it's how those technologies are distributed, who has access to those technologies, who's profiting off those technologies, how are they, how do we, as we embrace new technology, how do we simultaneously change the financial and social and economic systems to help us move toward a more equitable, healthy, renewable-based future. So I think if you step back from the individual technologies, and it's not saying technology is bad, right? Like obviously we need new technologies, and we need to deploy the technologies we already have in new ways. But we need to. So I wouldn't distinguish among the technologies necessarily. I would take a more systemic approach and say we need to move from this system to this kind of a system, and it's emergent. We don't know exactly what that looks like. It's a mix between my vision and many of the visions of an energy democracy future is a heterogeneous mix of different renewables. Every community on Earth has access to some renewable resources. So if we invest in ways so that communities can have local, regionally appropriate mix of energy, like that's a possibility. It's not technology specific. Does that make sense? Yeah.
We'll come back to the questions on technology, I guess, in a moment. But I have a question for you, Mariana. You are the author of a book entitled, I'm sorry, I have to write it down not to confuse it, Mind-Made Politics, Cognitive Roots of International Climate Governance. So do cognitive theories tell us something about this preference for delay and pushing things forward somewhere towards the future rather than action today, and like this form of what might be called climate procrastination, perhaps?
Yeah, thank you. So the book itself was not about delay. It investigated kind of the cognitive patterns and belief systems of international climate change negotiators. But yes, cognitive theories can tell us, I think, a lot about patterns of denial and the topic of this panel. And I think it links a little bit to the pattern of ideological delay as well. So what cognitive theories do tell us is what kinds of beliefs people hold, why they have them, why they change their mind sometimes, and also why they reject certain ideas that we call scientific facts, for example. So in that sense, it's a fascinating topic that helps us understand how people think, right, and how they feel as well. So it's very integrated. And the way it tries to do that is to conceptualize our mind as a network of concepts of ideas. So the beliefs we hold are not independent of each other. They're interdependent. They have to make sense as a whole, as a system. So the key principle here is emotional coherence. If you hold multiple beliefs, they have to kind of fit together. So for example, if you believe that burning trees causes or relates CO2 in the atmosphere, you also think more CO2 increases global warming, then you have to believe burning trees causes global warming. Those things make sense. You have an emotional layer in there too. For example, if you don't like burning trees because you have environmental values, you love trees, then the notion that they cause climate change and you're worried about climate change because of your values, your environmental values, then that reinforces your notion that burning trees is bad, right? So you have loops where emotional features matter as well. And in those overall systems of thinking about the world and about climate change, some beliefs are more important than others. So we have some stable value hubs that hold everything together, right? And if you think about it that way, then when people encounter ideas or deal with issues like technology or just even the idea of climate change itself, they have to fit that into their existing belief systems, which are complex and ideological in many ways, right? And so for some people that's easy, right? You have beliefs where that fits here, we have these kinds of maybe technological solutions or other ways of dealing with this. But for some people, in particular folks with a conservative ideology, the notion of climate change is really tricky because it undoes the current balance or their coherent way of seeing the world, which has roots in things like small government, individual freedom, or extractivism of kind of this heroic activity of industriousness. So this undoing of your existing balance is resisted, right? So your mind is defending what is there from this threat of the coherence that it has. It has different strategies of dealing with that. It can reject it, explain it away, and we've seen that possibility leveraged by lots of organizations who have fostered the denial of this is true for a long time. It can only try to say, all right, I'll embrace it as an exception to my rule, right? I attach it somehow, but that's awkward and it has a small place. Or I reorganize my beliefs, which maybe means giving the notion of small government less value or importance. That is the hardest thing. That's a lot of cognitive work, and it's uncomfortable because it means changing those central components of your belief system, which is why you see that as a major mechanism, and it moved from denial to delay when it was less possible to deny a reality that is increasingly has evidence, because your brain also uses evidence around it to make sense of and confirm whether its beliefs are still appropriate or good, right? So that's why we've seen this shift, I think. But that gives you a sense of how this works and why denial can be cognitively explained as a completely rational phenomenon. Your brain has coherence and tries to keep it. So this is a problem of fit. More specifically in my book, though, I added a bit of a layer of complexity to that notion by saying, or finding, that for people who are engaged in climate change professionally or negotiating this subject, delay is not really a big problem, but they still have very different attitudes towards how fast we should be moving. And that depends, or those patterns of who is more in favor of ambitious action versus more delayed or slower action depends on kind of an interaction of three kinds of belief types: identity, threat or risk assessment, and justice, or notions of justice, wrong and right. And so you can think about identity. So how does an actor think about himself, herself, themselves? And maybe an individual. Am I a fisherman who has to feed my family with what I do on a daily basis? Am I the owner of an international shipping company that sells fish in international markets? Am I a regulator of the European fish markets and worried about that whole system and its actors. So you can have smaller or larger and more inclusive identities. And then what kind of identity you have matters for who you care about and therefore who is affected by climate change in what way. That speaks to risk perceptions, right? Some people have very different assessments of the kind of threat that climate change poses. Some think of it as something that threatens their lives and livelihoods, maybe even their nations, their existence as a nation. Others, more of it as, this could harm my profit, my property value, my infrastructure. So it's more of it's a material, economic, financial concern. And these are, our brain treats them very differently in the quality they have. So then it attaches different moral rules to the kinds of perceptions that we have. So the pattern is that people who tend to have bigger, more diverse, more inclusive identities, maybe the people that they care about are more geographically spread out, tend to worry more about existential threats of climate change, those that threaten lives, livelihoods, existence, health and well-being. While those that tend to have somewhat more narrow, maybe organizational or national identities, think about more the economic and financial concerns, threats to profit, and that is associated more with a concern about what does it cost me. And that has a set of different normal or moral rules attached to it. So the former pattern tends to think more about let's do something fast, and the pattern that's more narrow is more like let's see what it costs and how we can get there most cost effectively, or whatever technology allows us to keep things mostly the way things are. So that's, I think, a couple of ways that cognitive theories can help us understand these patterns.
Great, fantastic. I mean, this is very interesting, and I think it does take away this not very helpful approach that many, well, in the climate movement might have, which is very much focused on value judgments and casting this whole struggle as, a fight between good and evil, where you have those evil, profit maximizing capitalists and politicians on the one hand, and on the other hand you have supposedly, those who are fighting for the good, global good. And of course, I mean, there are situations where that might be true, where you do have, as you say, people who are indeed following this economic calculus very consciously. But on the other hand, you also say that there are large groups of people who just think about this issue differently, and it shouldn't be treated as, something that they do wrong. It's just they're conditioned in a way to do that.
Not all nefarious deniers. That
exactly.
Yeah, so it's, yeah.
Of course, the other thing is, this whole discourse about them being, associated with flat Earth and tinfoil conspiracy theories, which is also not probably, oversimplification. But so this is going to surely open up a lot of possibilities for debate later today and during our workshop. Now I wanted to bring the discussion closer to home, or to here, to Norway. Of course, Norway is an interesting case because it is at the same time casting itself as a green champion. And on the other hand, it's of course a society which has built much of its wealth on hydrocarbon exports. And if you ask Norwegian stakeholders about their preferred visions of decarbonization and ambitious climate action, they would probably mention 3 technologies, like just off the top of their heads. So one is offshore wind for clean energy, clean electricity generation. Second is hydrogen, which supposedly builds on the gas sector's experience and can be used for storage and for clean transportation. And the third one is carbon capture and storage, CCS, where Norway sees itself as a potential future hub for all of Europe. So coming back to your presentation, Jenny, of course CCS has all the features of this kind of conservative technology, which preserves a lot of status quo in the fossil fuel sector. It kind of extends the life of the fossil fuel industry. But at the same time, if you talk to trade unions here in Norway, they are also very supportive of CCS because they see it as a tool for a just transition, for preserving what they see as climate justice. So what would you respond to them if you were sitting in a panel with, let's say, a representative of LO, whom we have seen yesterday? I mean, we were watching the building from the outside.
Yeah, great question. So Norway, my understanding, is among the richest countries in the world with the nicest lifestyle, nicest food, nicest everything, buildings. So, of course, here, you know, people, I don't know, but I'm projecting that people want to sustain that, right? And are not, you know, calling necessarily for major revolutionary change in the economic system because it's working for most people. And I imagine the trade unions are obviously focused on making sure that workers continue to have good lifestyle. So I understand that tension, and that's emerging in lots of fossil fuel-based economies and jobs, right? Whether it be coal mining, oil extraction, you know, lots of places that are struggling with this. So my, you know, again, I think the possibility is stepping back and thinking bigger, right? If we really are talking about transformation, and that is all the money that could go into carbon capture and storage technology, which is very, very expensive, very, very inefficient. The amount of energy that is needed just to like do the carbon capture is huge. So like basically your energy demand goes way up if you start using carbon capture and storage. Yes, you can, you know, take some of the carbon dioxide and make it go in somewhere else other than the atmosphere, right? Like, so that is it, technically it's a thing that can be done. But if you, again, if you think broader about how expensive, how much energy, how much money, how much resources, I mean, I find it, you know, what if that same money went to the trade union workers and investing in other jobs for them, right? So it's just thinking, it's thinking about bigger systemic change. And I don't know enough about the political situation here to know exactly what the right strategic framing or possibilities would be, but that is, I mean, I think I would suggest that Norway has to, like every fossil fuel embedded interested country, region, company, you know, has to face the increasing pressure to leave it in the ground, right? I know that doesn't sound politically or economically feasible, and that's why we are where we are, because the science has been telling us that for 30 years, but we haven't been able to do that. So, you know, still, you know, plenty of people will say we still will never be able to do that. But many of us, including the youth movement, you know, think that we could do that if we reinvest in ways so that people's livelihoods are not threatened. The reality is so many people's livelihoods are being threatened because we're continuing to rely on fossil fuels. So that would be my response.
Yeah, right. I mean, it is a very difficult political discussion here, and there's, of course, different interests and then points of view and ideologies as well. So passing over to Manjana, who is working on analyzing the Norwegian debate on climate right now, regarding strategies of delay employed by different Norwegian stakeholders. How would you, I mean, with the experience you already have, I mean, you've been here for a year and a half, you said, right? That you've managed to notice already, how would you map this landscape? So to what extent are visions of net zero, perhaps, based on those large planned negative emissions, so CCS mostly, and discourses of just transition, instruments of delay. Do you see them as instruments of delay? And on the other hand, do you also see signs of ambitious climate action in the industry and organized labor?
So thank you. That's a challenging question, and as you mentioned, I'm fairly new to Norway, so I'm still learning a lot about the system. My current project investigates or focuses, first of all, on government and industry players. So I haven't looked into trade unions or labor unions, so that's still kind of on the margins, but might have to become more important. But I do look into the future visions, the long-term climate visions that these actors currently develop, because I believe, I think Jenny thinks so too, is that these future visions are really important. They're sometimes seen as delay strategies, especially when they're filled with technological promise rather than reality. But these future visions, if you want them to be transformative, we have to have ideas of how we want to reorganize our society if actually we want to get there. So it's very important to have them. And so therefore I'm looking into what does the government currently portray as the future vision for Norway, and also what do key industry players do. I know most at this point about government visions, so I can talk a little bit about that. So the Norwegian government has chosen as a key term the low emissions society for 2050. It doesn't talk about net zero. That's not a key term for the government. It's low emissions. It's not zero emissions. It's low emissions. And the way the government talks about how this is being achieved is by a sectoral transition where every economic sector moves from its current use of technologies to a low-carbon set of technologies. So it fits really nicely with this theme we've been talking about so far. It's somewhat narrow, right? It thinks largely about the economy. It's not about social changes. It's not about changes in government-society relationships. It's not about fundamental changes of how the market works or how economy-nature relations might work, or principles. It's not about that. It's everything will stay the same, except that we're using different technologies in 2050. And so then the way this is supposed to happen, or the key protagonist in this story, becomes the private sector. So government is clearly putting the private sector in the driver's seat by saying, well, our job is to create a carbon price to make sure that this is basically expensive to emit carbon. And we've kind of done this already. We can crank the price, but done this, right? And the second job is to fund and support the development and spread of these low-emission technologies in various sectors. So that's how the government looks at its own role. It's not a regulator. It's not a promoter of new institutional innovations or changes. It's supporting private actors in generating and spreading low-emission technologies. Right? And energy is, of course, core in this. And maybe more importantly, so this is both a very energy-driven or technology-driven view of the future, but more importantly, it's silent about oil. So the key assumption is that Norway's wealth today has been generated by oil. Future well-being of society depends on oil. What's worked well? We're not going to shake the foundations of our society. This is again, in cognitive terms, the most threatening, unbalancing thing you can think about, removing oil from the wealth creation of Norway. And so it's not being talked about other than we'll continue to need oil. It's justified actually with a global narrative, because all of the Norwegian oil actually is exported. You don't need any of it, right? It goes to other countries, and you don't have to account for it internationally because the Paris Agreement doesn't require you account for oil that you sell. It only accounts for your national footprint. So Norway operates in this lovely blind spot of the international infrastructure when it comes to climate change governance, where you can keep selling the oil and not being responsible for it. So you can create this interesting narrative around we need oil. Other countries continue to need oil to grow, especially the global south. So there is this narrative of, because it's still needed for the growth and development of poorer developing countries, we, generating the greenest, most democratic and cleanest oil in the world, should be doing the production of the oil rather than others. So that is the narrative of why the Norwegian oil is needed. And that is where the industry narratives, in particular of Equinor, completely matches the government narrative. The world, of course, is in a path towards energy transitions. There'll be less oil and less gas in the future, and particularly less coal. But some more oil is needed for the support of the developing countries' growth. So there's a clear narrative of, yes, climate action, It's the first thing. But we need oil, and we need to do a whole lot of other technological things, as you said, hydrogen, offshore wind, and CCS. So for all of these other technologies, Equinor says we are responsible. Yes, we manage the government narratives. Industry is doing its share. It takes up its responsibility by developing these technologies. So they're completely matching this government narrative. We have a very strongly aligned way of talking about this, which you can say delay or doesn't even tackle the question of how do we get out of oil. So there's a big inconsistency. One last point I want to make, I know I've been talking for a long time, and that's about negative emissions or CCS. And I'm gonna put myself very clearly apart from Jenny's position. We need CCS. We need negative emissions. Because we haven't done anything for the last 30 years, we're now in a place where all our climate models tell us we cannot reach any of our climate goals if we do not have and quickly scale up negative emissions technologies. So somebody has to talk about them, has to envision them, has to invest in them now. Not enough people in the world do that. The Norwegian government does. Equinor does too, right? So there are the people who do it. So credit where credit is due. This is a narrative. If you want to make these technologies happen, we have to envision them into our future trajectories, and it has to happen much faster than we're doing. Norway is one of the few governments who actively put money, maybe not enough money, into developing these. We have to pull carbon out of the atmosphere if you want to reach 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. So yes, it is a big component of the conversation. I think it should be.
Very much. There's an interesting tension developing here, I see. So Jenny says we shouldn't go in CCS. You say we need negative emissions to meet our targets. And Brian has been saying that perhaps we're living in denial regarding what our technologies are doing. So for instance, maybe, taking this view to its logical consequences, perhaps we should also live up to the reality that we might not meet the 2 degree target. And what do we do then? Brian, just to take this discussion to slightly more optimistic places.
Good.
So what do we do about this? Mariana has sketched the Norwegian governmental official vision, but there's also a lot of bottom-up visions of transition and transformation. You've been looking at the differences between social movements and kind of civil society actors in the US and Europe and their visions and programs for transformation. So what are the ideas there, if you could just map them out?
It's varied, obviously. There's a huge disagreement about what transformation is or how to go about it. A lot to say, a lot of good points. I want to go back to some of those as well. But, I'll say a couple things. One, there's a really good book written that some of you have already read, I'm sure, Kari Norgard's excellent book, Living in Denial, which focuses on Norway. And what she points out very distinctly is that it's actually, again, this sort of social norm. It's not individuals making bad decisions. It's that collectively people don't see any need for change. They don't see any need for fundamentally addressing climate change. They don't see any need for taking really serious actions in the short term. That's true of other countries as well. So that is fundamentally, I think, a major issue that aligns very directly with this whole idea of environmentalists, again, pushing for essentially technological changes. And let's just take this discussion as a starting point. Nobody has said anything about why don't we just use less energy? Instead of having carbon capture and storage, why don't we just figure out how to use way less energy from the very beginning? Because carbon capture and storage hasn't actually worked yet, and it's fundamentally tied to a capitalist growth-based economy. Now, we might need it in some cases, but why don't we just use less energy from the very beginning? But that gets at the other issues of why is it that people who are in mining and fossil fuels are afraid of talking about climate change? Because they're not actually talking about climate change. They're talking about their well-being, their worldviews, their communities that they care deeply about. And if you say you can't have those anymore, that's really serious. So let's just be honest and say, actually, it is going to be extremely disruptive. People are going to lose their jobs. We're going to have to actually make serious decisions and insert into our societies caps, not just about carbon emissions, but how much money people can have, how many fossil fuels they can use. Those are really serious questions. When you talk to people about transformation who are, again, outside the norms of narrow conversations about change, That's what they're talking about. We can't have the same system we have currently and drastically reduce emissions. That's a fundamental incompatibility. And so transformation really means having a different kind of society, fundamentally. And that is, again, worrisome to some. It's challenging to people. People in the fossil fuel industry are going to suffer. There's just no question about that if we're going to reduce emissions. Okay, so we have to have those kinds of conversations from the very beginning, and then think about what a different kind of society would look like, which Jenny points to in some ways. We can't have a fossil fuel-based economy. We have to have different provisioning. We have to have allocation of who owns resources, who owns energy. That has to be totally changed. So the people who are talking about transformation are having very different conversations about how do we tweak the initial system we have, or how do we have different kinds of technologies, and instead saying we need to really reshape and rethink a society that's no longer economically growth-based, and that has energy provisioning that's intended to meet needs, not to make profits. Now, there's a million things underneath all of that, of course, and I don't want to take all of our time, but you get the idea. The fact is there has to be a total disruption of our contemporary society in basically all facets, and that just fundamentally is destabilizing and a threat to many, many people. On the other hand, super exciting, because there's so much going on, so many possibilities in which you can envision a society in which we actually think about people's well-being first and foremost, not about profits. It's a fundamentally reshaping of priorities. And again, there's a million things underneath that, but there's a lot of things going on, a lot of people talking about new ways of orchestrating democracy, of thinking about how to allocate resources, of reprioritizing our goals in society. All of that is super exciting. It's a long ways off. It's not to say any of that's going to happen at the moment, but this gets exactly what we're talking about. We have these notions that are fundamentally delaying us from getting to the kind of discussions we need to have in which we can envision a different kind of society.
Thank you very much for this. Before we open to a conversation with the audience, we still have roughly 30 minutes to go in this seminar. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to ask questions to each other if if you have some. Does anyone want to go first?
Well, I
Jenny?
just wanted to kind of respond to a couple things that each of you said. First, you just mentioned the opportunity, the exciting possibilities, and a temporal dimension, saying like, yes, we're still far from that. But I just want to say with change and time, there is no, it's not, we know change, and especially when we're talking about transformative, bigger systematic change, it's not linear. It's not like, oh, we need 5 years, oh, we need 10 years, oh, we need 20 years. Like we learned during the pandemic, if we have to, things can change actually very quickly. So I would just say, again, I'm not saying I think there's going to be huge change next week or next year, but I think things are building, and there's tipping points with social change as well. And I think we're getting to a place where it's getting around the world. I mean, there's so much instability and disruption already, or without, maintaining the status quo is very disruptive as well. So at some point, we're going to get to a point where things could change very quickly, I guess.
Yeah, I agree.
It's possible.
Absolutely.
Who
absolutely.
knows? None of us can predict the future.
But
it's definitely not linear, and we don't know. And that's part of, especially academics and those looking at history and like thinking of, we look at these cost curves about over time, and like projecting that things are going to go kind of the way they've been going isn't always helpful, I guess. It also can be scary, obviously, when we look at temperature and all kinds of things. And then to carbon capture and storage, I just wanted to acknowledge, I think partly in the same way how I responded to Casper's question about renewables, I'm not saying there's no space for, sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and trying to store it somewhere, or out of the fossil fuel combustion. But the amount of attention and energy and resources that go to that, when it could be going to reducing energy use in the first place, or these other options, it's just so frustrating, I guess. And the premise that, all the scientists keep saying, oh, we need these negative emissions technologies if we're going to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees. We're probably not going to reach 1.5 or 2 degrees. So why are we using that as a, like, I mean, I'm not saying they're not good targets, but climate policy is full of all these targets that we never achieve. So like, why now are we at a point where, oh, now we're going to pull out the brakes and, you know, invest in these very expensive fossil fuel perpetuating technologies? Like, why not just put all that money where it needs to go? You know, that's the, but I understand that, you know, the train has left the station and a lot of money is going to carbon capture and storage, and Norway is at the forefront. And yeah. Good.
I can respond to that, although I wanted to leave it to Brian, who seemed to have a very urgent question.
No.
I wanted to encourage us, or maybe just throw that back out to all of you, in terms of assuming that we will need negative emissions technologies, carbon capture and storage and others, but also taking serious the notions that we need to take a more systemic approach and thinking about the redistribution of power and really envisioning a different kind of future for our societies. What could that look like? Right? We need very concrete ideas of how this could be done without perpetuating the fossil fuel-based power concentrating economy or political economy that we have. So can these things be done, and how can introducing them change the structure and face of our society and how we relate to nature and to each other along the way? So how can we actually rethink the development and spread of these necessary technologies, maybe in particular negative emissions technologies, while reconfiguring our societies? We really need concrete ideas of how this could look differently, not just saying, don't do that. What is it? How can we think about a future of Norway where there is no more oil industry, but we have a different set of technologies, ownership relations, social relations, institutions that maintain high living standards, happiness, but, you know, do away with the current ways of concentrating power and wealth, and do away with fossil fuels?
Brian, you're advocating?
Yeah, I'm working on that project right now, actually, trying to figure it out. Yeah, not for Norway specifically, but yes, I think all of that is true. And again, I think there's a lot of overlap in many of the things we're discussing here. The question is, how do we get past what we have, what we know is an unsustainable situation? That's the fundamental question. And there's just different ways of thinking about that. And the question is, how do different technologies play into that? My own view is that the whole focus on technologies has completely distracted us from all the other discussions of the questions you're just asking, basically, because it locks in place the notion that we have to have increasing levels of energy production as a starting point, that we have to have increasing levels of economic wealth as a starting point, instead of questioning those from the very beginning and moving away from technology from the starting point and thinking about just how do we have a different kind of society. And then at the back end, thinking about what kinds of technologies do we need to support that.
I would like to open the discussion. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, and there's going to be a microphone passed around. So don't be shy. Questions, comments? Yep.
Hi. Thanks to everybody for a really interesting and stimulating discussion. I had a question for Brian. So you said something about that we need to move beyond this kind of capitalist society that we have now, and profit-driven, I think it was. So, and I guess it's kind of the same question you asked. I mean, most experiments at getting away from capitalism entirely, there are different forms of capitalism, softer and harder and different types. But there aren't that many, there have been some attempts to overcome it, to get away from it. North Korea, China, Soviet Union in its time. And most of them haven't been very successful. In terms of incentives and how you organize society and so on, checks and balances and so on. So I'm wondering, what would this system then, this future society that would be better dealing with climate change, but not be capitalist, how would that be organized?
Yeah, excellent question. So it's not a focus necessarily on capitalism. It just so happens that capitalism has a particular mechanism, which is economic growth. So if you look at historically the USSR, for example, or contemporary China, they're both communist countries, but they're fundamentally growth-based. It's actually economic growth that's the issue, not capitalism per se. That's kind of it's an important distinction. Now, your other question is really important, though. How do we get past all of this? The people who are mostly working on this think about provisioning in a different way. And what they say, it's not about basing our society on the notion that you have to have perpetual economic growth in order to meet needs, which is just empirically false. We have increasing economic growth all the time, more and more problems all the time, environmental and social. So there's no correlation or direct linkage between economic growth and well-being. So it's a shift away from that premise to what people are calling basically a good life for all. Now, a good life for all, there's all kinds of questions within that. What does a good life even mean? How do you differentiate a good life between people in different countries, for example? But the fact is, the argument being made by people who are proposing this suggests that you don't actually have to have economic growth for well-being, and instead you have to have redistribution to meet people's needs. And that's the basic premise. Now, how you do that, of course, is complicated. But it suggests that you cannot actually reduce emissions fundamentally if you have economic growth as the basis of society. And you can't have well-being if you have these power differentials in society that are based on an economic growth model in which people are treated unfairly. You have billionaires and the super poor, the widening inequality gap. All of that comes out of a system and society based on economic growth. There's been lots of work that's shown that economic growth doesn't lead to well-being in all kinds of different ways. And so the question is, how do you have well-being for all while reducing total production, economic gain, and so forth? That's the question. And there's lots of people who are working on that. There's different models. You could look at different countries. You can, the Happy Planet Index and those things. But the basic bottom line is you can't have economic growth and reduced emissions and well-being.
So I would just quickly add to that one, because this is something I'm spending some of my sabbatical ahead of me exploring, is kind of innovations in our financial systems. To think about non-extractive finance so that governments can provide money to either zero interest loans or negative interest loans, actually pay people to make the changes that are needed so that it's not this elitist thing where only the rich countries get efficient buildings and the rich people within other within countries get the efficient things. So that's one idea. This notion of non-extractive finance, I think, is a big one. And also, as you mentioned, our mainstream economic and political assumptions that growth equals well-being and we have to keep having growth is we can see that it's false, yet we're not like calling it out enough, right? And we keep thinking that this is the way. And I will also just say our perceptions of how much the government is involved in our free market is also distorted, because we learned during the pandemic the central banks just threw money into the system. And we could do that again. And when there's a war right now, the United States and many countries are throwing money, just creating money and throwing it out, right, to support war efforts. And we basically could generate all that money. It's not, and it keeps coming. And we could do that for climate. And the central banks could change the way they do things and support the changes for well-being rather than corporate profits. And so we have so many mechanisms that are distorted and assumptions that are false in our economic systems. And I think some of us are just realizing this recently. I mean, I'll include myself. I've gotten more and more interested in understanding our financial systems and debt. The crippling effect of debt, whether it be individuals and households in debt or countries in debt. Like, we cannot get to a better place until we, debt relief, I think, is part of financial innovation that we need to think about it. And it's connected to climate. So those are just another set of ideas. You asked about what are some visions? What can change? And I think there's some very specific things that can change and have a big impact.
Tatiana?
Tatiana Stankovic. I'm a researcher here at the NUBI. Thank you all for a very interesting discussion. I have a question for Mariana. So I understand you were studying the vision of the Norwegian government. I would like to hear whether there is a difference in vision between a conservative and Labour government. And the other thing is how the vision of the Norwegian government compares to other oil-producing countries that are democratic and can be compared to Norway. Thank you.
Thank you. They're fascinating questions I wish I could answer. But the second one I'm not even attempting to answer, so I haven't done a comparison to other oil-producing countries' visions. It would be certainly fascinating to ask in particular about Middle Eastern countries, how they look at this right now. And in terms of differences between conservatives and Labour, so this is kind of the next stage. I focused so far on the Solberg government until like a year and a half ago, and now we have to see. But I can't yet perceive a significant difference, to be honest, right? So we had a short blip before the election where there was actually a conversation about ending oil or phase out dates for oil production in Norway, but it has gone away since Labour's been in power. So yeah, I don't know much about that yet. I hope in a few weeks I can tell you more, because this is kind of the next stage of my coding efforts. Sorry.
Thank you so much. I was very inspired and also depressed by this. But I was I have a question for you, Brian, because I was really intrigued by the ideological denialism that you were talking about. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about that and what are the consequences of this.
Yeah, so we wrote about this, drawing on a lot of other people. I'll just give you the most obvious example. Especially in the United States, almost all of the discussion around climate change and what to do about it is technological. So if we just had more solar panels, and I can say, in my hometown, all of the discussion around climate change primarily is around shifting to alternative energy. It's like just totally dominating. But if you look at the evidence, and there have been sociologists in particular who have done this research and looked at panel data from 25 or 30 countries, the evidence is totally overwhelming. When you add more energy from solar panels, it just adds more energy to the entire system. It doesn't actually displace fossil fuels. There is no evidence that alternative energy in our current configuration in society leads to a reduction in fossil fuels or carbon emissions. That's just empirical. This is based on the evidence. And yet, the environmental movement in the US is totally fixated on basically alternative energy. And if you look at the recent legislation coming out of the US, a lot of that money is going to electric cars and purportedly building more alternative energy. As opposed to, why don't we just reduce total energy use from the beginning? Again, that's not part of the conversation. So it's this ideological denialism about, again, what's causing the problem and how to actually address it. And the consequences, of course, are it's fundamentally delaying the kinds of interventions that would actually lead to a reduction in emissions. And that's why it's so important. And again, in our view, especially in the US, the environmental movement is completely captured with this line of thinking. And that's in part why, after 30 years, we have almost no reductions in emissions.
It's very interesting, although I just as a side note, of course, energy efficiency has been this kind of ugly duckling of energy policy for many years, but now the situation in Europe suddenly makes us prioritize energy efficiency quickly. There's two more questions here.
So two for Manjana. So one is linked to Jenny's point on these kind of social tipping points. A more question about the pathways to cognitive transformations, not just economic transformation, but to what extent can we be optimistic, or what are the mechanisms by which you might move between different identities, move away from being perhaps defensive? And then a separate point, question about the sort of future imaginaries within Norway and how inclusive the creation of those is, and I suppose there's maybe a formal and an informal aspect to that. I guess I'm thinking mainly formal, but maybe there's an informal as well. So how much, or to what extent is civil society or the artistic community, we were having a chat yesterday about that, kind of feed into the vision of what a future Norway and Norwegian energy system could be? Thanks.
Thank you. They're both super interesting questions to me and my work in particular. So I've been thinking about this cognitive transformation, as you called it, quite a bit. And I think, especially in terms of the current ideological constellations of thinking about the world in the United States, that has driven my work in the past, where it's a big question of how do you, I want to say help, conservatives reconfigure their way of thinking about climate change, because you have to enable them to stay true to their values, right? It has to become a new coherent set of ideas, emotionally coherent set of ideas, about how society should be organized, that allows conservatives to hold on to some of their central value tenets, while certainly rebalancing others, like the notion of small government and individualism can't quite stay the same, or at least not be understood in the same way that they are right now. So I think a pathway always involves people who have authority in that community, who have to come up with new kinds of stories to understand what these values mean in these new contexts, right? Drawing on the new evidence of climate change and how it interrupts our world already, using those as leverage points to create stories about how conservatism can be understood in a way that's consistent with the existence of climate change, but also consistent with solutions to climate change that are actually working, right? So that's how you have to think about new conservative narratives that keep in place a number of things, but reinterpret and re-understand things through story, which is why I like your question about art. Can I get a break? I can come back in a second.
Yeah. So just like.
Yes, thank you very much to all. My name is Solveig Aamodt. I work at CSIRO, Center for Climate Research. And I think all of you should come to CSIRO to teach us something. But the ideological denialism resonates very well with Norway, and also what kind of research is financed in Norway, and what kind of research that Norwegian politicians think would be important for our future. But my question, I could say a lot of things, but try to narrow it into a question. I'm a political scientist, so my research is on decision making, and political decision making is not about future in 2050, it's about next year's budget. And I think that if you ask politicians to imagine, like you imagine a low carbon future, and even a lot of, maybe not a lot of, but there are politicians in Norway that would agree that growth is not the way forward. Like they're even represented in the parliament. That would agree with your, that we're on the wrong track, that growth shouldn't be the premise. But when it comes down to the division of budgets for health, for education, even those people need income. So how do you change that discussion? How do you, we have people that have talked about this in Norway for decades. Karen O'Brien has been trying to get people on this transformation track, and she's done a fundamental job, but it's not seeping into decision making. So how can that be done? Yeah.
Well, you want to take it?
No.
No, okay. I think in part it goes back to the discussion earlier, which is I think it's just counterproductive to fundamentally start the conversations with climate change, because that, I think, is the wrong approach. We need to have a society where people are doing well, and the fact is we have allocation of resources at every level of government which undermines that and is super carbon intensive at the same time. So I think we need to have a different kind of discussion about how we can allocate our resources in ways that allow people to flourish and do well. That actually has tremendous implications for how people at the local level make decisions every day, every year in their budgets, for example. So just as an example, in my hometown, we're constantly talking about, again, more solar panels, basically. But people don't have better lives because of solar panels, and particularly in our country because it's mostly super wealthy people that have them in the first place who don't need them. But people do need other things. They need transportation systems that work. They need affordable housing that's not cold in the winter. And actually, those things are extremely important for reducing total emissions. So the best way in most places to reduce emissions is not from alternative energy, but it's to have people get around town differently and live differently. So if you focus on actually meeting people's needs first and foremost, you focus on how we've organized ourselves, how we live, all of a sudden that not only front loads this whole notion of how we have a better livability, basically, but it's actually way less carbon intensive as well. Now, your question about how we finance that, it's an important one. That's going to have to come from redistribution. And frankly, I just don't see it possible to have continuing economic growth and reduction in emissions. So from my perspective, it's totally obvious. We have to just get to the core of this and say we just cannot have economic growth anymore. That leads to the really difficult questions of how to then reallocate resources. But if we care about addressing emissions and having livability, we just cannot have a growth-based society. And it's just going to be hard discussions and decisions.
So just quickly, great question. And I think the context in the United States is probably different than Norway. Very different,
Yeah,
I would say.
absolutely.
So I don't know strategically what might work here, but my idea or perception comes to the third point that you made about cognitive fit, that you didn't actually go into depth on about social justice or your people's individual perceptions of justice. And I wonder, I don't know, but like, is there a place for Norwegians and Norway to I mean, some of the discussion about how much Norway funds in climate research and technological research and energy research, it's kind of been characterized as like guilt money, right? In a sense. And I'm wondering, are there deeper like justice issues that Norwegian political systems could focus on, given how chaotic the rest of the world is, and increasingly it is, and how, I mean, I don't know all the domestic challenges that are faced here in Norway, but the perception from is that it's more stable and less acute suffering than most other places in the world. So is there something in that space that could be impact decision making? I don't know. I'm just speculating. So
I want to also pick this up because this is key, and it's the same across all countries where our decision making institutions have a short-term focus. They all do. It's politics. 3, 4, 5 years, budget terms, quarters for companies, while the climate problem challenges us to think along decades, centuries, even millennia. Our minds can do this very well, and our institutions cannot. They cannot. So one way to think about actually the kinds of changes we need to address this problem is to redesign, or at least innovate with our democratic institutions that allow us to take these longer term timelines into account today, because it matters today for what the world will be like in 2050 and even in 2500. Right? It matters. So therefore, being able to innovate in our political institutions and our decision-making concepts is really key, and nobody is thinking about that at the moment. I think that's a key component of how we have to vision differently. So what you need in the way we have set up politics right now is at least voter support for these longer-term dimensions of politics, and you build that with, I guess, government-orchestrated processes of visioning for the kinds of future that we want and how to get there. Right, so then I think it's really key that governments in this situation where the future is so open now to change will come, and we need change, right? We both have climate change as a forcer of change in societies, and the idea of transformation as kind of this deliberate approach to it that goes very slow. But change will happen. So the future has been opened to, we have to create it. And so governments have a key democratic function to facilitate this conversation about where society should go. And I think that's a novel function that to actually do that. And that comes a bit to Thomas's question about what's the role also of artists or civil society in this, right? And how do we see it? Do they speak to each other? So Norway has, as far as I know, and I'm still new to the system, so far I see a very government only, no, not only approach. There's lots of interaction between government and business, of course, right? So the strong alignment I talked about, there is a lot of interaction. But there is not really a deliberation process that's publicly facilitated beyond what the 2050 Climate Change Committee. So we do have, and I didn't know this until very recently, a Norwegian 2050 Climate Change Committee that is supposed to consult with all actors in society to figure out kind of what are the key challenges we need to consider on our path to the low-emission society. I think it's still too narrow and too little known to really have a broader conversation with all stakeholders. And I do believe art has a big role to play in this. Actually, my project right now compares government, industry, civil society, and culture. So artistic visions, in particular climate fiction novels, and the narratives in those, trying to compare across those to see how do they intersect, do they talk to each other, are they very different, what kinds of conflicts do they contain when we think about moving into the future, so what kinds of futures do they envision. So I think that's a job government where it could start, where you could build political support from your voters for a budget allocation that might reach beyond the next 4 years or 1 year, right? So, but that's a key challenge, institutional changes.
Very quickly, just to loop back to how I started us off, your question is actually, and your answer about we need innovation in our processes, in our politics, in our political systems. Like, we can't just assume that the political systems and how we do things are, the only way to do things, right? And so I just want to make the point that gets to my point of we focus too much on technological innovation, not enough on social innovation, political innovation, economic innovation, financial innovation. And so I think that gets to why it's been so hard, right? And so thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. We are now out of time. So thank you very much for your engagement, for coming. Thanks to the panelists for this, as you said, at the same time inspiring and depressing message. So is it impressing or despiring? I'm not sure how you combine those two, like a hybrid message that we had here today. Yes, thank you very much for today, and I hope that something material can flow out of this in form of something more lasting, perhaps some publication that will sum up the findings of this workshop today. Thanks a lot again, and yeah.
Thank you.
Very much.